I want to talk today about whether or not your thought patterns are hurting or helping you. There are some thought patterns that we can find out in cognitive behavioral therapy that can be incredibly harmful, and there are some questions that I've got from my experience, not just as a physician, but as a mental health patient. How do we handle some of those thought patterns? Cognitive behavioral therapy is probably the best studied and best proven mental health therapy that's on the market right now. And one of the basic underlying principles is this triangle, right? Where your behavior and your thoughts and your emotions all influence each other. So certain behavior can actually worsen the thoughts that you have, and certain thoughts can worsen your emotions, and they can go in this frustrating and discouraging circle. So there's essentially a number of questions that you can go through to see if your distressing and stressful thoughts, well, to see, number one, if they are healthy for you, if they are grounded in reality, and then also how to deal with them so that you don't have to have so much panic and misery. And these are some really basic but very helpful tools that I think everyone should have in their toolbox. So the first question is going to be, when we are disputing, challenging, or distressing thinking, do your thoughts have must, need to, got to, have to, or should in them? The reason that we ask those is because that can be associated with the kinds of expectations that we have for ourselves, and some of those expectations, or for other people. And sometimes those expectations can make it harder for us to function, and sometimes, that they should be there, quote unquote should. But a lot of times those thoughts are going to be more distressing than helpful. There's a wonderful thing that you'll hear therapists say sometimes, or at least I've heard more than one say, which is don't should all over yourself. We shouldn't be shitting on ourselves. Don't should on yourself. So the next question to look out for is going to be, do you have never, always, completely, totally, all, everything, and everyone in your thought pattern? And this should make some sense, right? Because if you make any kind of generalization like that, not only are you setting yourself and other people up for failure, but a lot of times those thoughts are not grounded in reality. There are very few things. There are some things for which those words apply, right? Because we do live in a world where there are some absolutes, and there are a lot of things that are not absolutes. I never like it when somebody says that there are no absolutes, because that is very clearly an absolute. So there have to be some absolutes in order for that to exist, right? In order for that to be true. But there are some absolutes that are, I think, very valuable and helpful. I know that some people find it very mentally helpful to have the idea, God always loves you. If that's a part of your spirituality, as it is mine, that can be a really comforting and healthy thought. But in general, the vast majority of absolutes are pretty dang harmful. The next question that you should ask your thoughts is, are you using the words awful, terrible, horrible, unbearable, disaster, worst ever? The reason I bring up those terms is, well, it's part of catastrophizing. And catastrophizing is a lot of times making your problem not necessarily worse than it is, because your problems are very valid and they may be very big. But it doesn't help you if you are looking at the problem in a way that it's going to become unsolvable. In other words, I'm not going to accuse you of making a mountain out of a molehill, but you don't want to make your mountain unclimbable, right? The way you climb Everest is you break it down into the parts of it that you can deal with. You make a plan for how you're going to bring your oxygen tanks, what kind of materials you're going to pack. You have plans that help you break down the task, right? That's how we say, if you're not a vegetarian, we say how you eat an elephant is one bite at a time. I guess if you're a vegetarian, I have a vegan coaching client to whom I say, you're a giant elephant-sized cake. How do you eat that? One bite at a time, right? So it doesn't help if you're using terms that are going to make it harder for you, such as unbearable disaster or worst ever. The fourth kind of keyword to look at your thoughts and see if they have is kind of these angry, negative words like jerk, slob, creep, hypocrite, bully, stupid, idiot. A lot of the kind of negative terms that you could be using either for yourself or for someone else. A lot of those are going to make you more miserable because they don't help you if it's an interpersonal situation, right? And yes, the negative terms I use are often much more vulgar. A lot of times, sexual assault victims will often use self-talk terms like whore, slut, other kinds of things or child abuse victims might use terms that were used during the assault for themselves in the self-talk thoughts. And then, as I was saying, when you're relating to other people, a lot of those kind of terms in your thoughts are not necessarily so helpful. I'm not saying you need to censor your thoughts. I'm saying, can we evaluate if a thought is particularly helpful or not? Like, is it actually going to solve the problem? And sometimes it's nice to just sit down and put the emotions down and let them, by down I mean like put them on paper or put them in artwork and let them flow. So I'm not saying don't have emotions, because it's important to have emotions, but when you need to get things done or you have a mission ahead of you, sometimes you'll have these repeated thoughts that are just going to get in your way and they're not going to help. So it kind of takes a balance of knowing, okay, I'm having so much overwhelming emotion, then maybe you need to turn to a different kind of technique like dialectical behavioral therapy, or I'm currently going through EAET therapy, which is a very emotion-centered therapy where like she'll have me do exercises like writing down all my angry thoughts and like really feeling them and being okay with feeling in pain or feeling unhappy. That is a different kind of thing, and those kind of therapies, specifically that therapy, you really have to have a well-trained provider. I could see someone really messing somebody up with that. DBT, like CBT, is a manualized therapy, so you can get a manual and you can work through it. But DBT is very good for calming down some of that emotions side of things. The big theory with CBT, though, that we're talking about is answering the negative thoughts and evaluating them for their usefulness. And that is a very different kind of structural paradigm where you don't focus on the emotion, you focus on the thought that's affecting the emotion, because sometimes you can't change the emotion, but you can very often change the thought, and that can help. So that can make a difference. How you express your emotions this CBT can be very helpful for something like that, like how you express your emotions, because it can help you figure out what kind of terms and thoughts, not just internally, but that you share externally, make a difference. So if that's you, this is probably kind of helpful. So what you can do is, I can link you to this handout that I'm using, or you can just take screenshots or write down. The best thing to do is to write down as I'm going along which of these evaluative techniques and evaluative questions you want to use for your own mental health experience, because when you write something down, there's actually studies that are fairly fascinating that unfortunately I can't cite for you right now because I learned them way back in undergrad, so I don't know exactly. I don't have a good citation for you. But back in undergrad, when I was taking neurology before I went to medical school, one of the things we learned in neurology was about how one side of the brain communicates better with the other when you're using things like handwriting, essentially drawing out organic chemistry structures or writing your thoughts out by hand, because it's kind of like the way there was a study that found surgeons did better who had video game experience with like first-person shooters because of the hand-eye coordination. This is kind of taking it to the next level, that like handwriting and other small coordinated efforts where you're completely focused on words that are also coming out your hand, right? There's a whole body kind of experience. There's kind of a mindfulness experience to that, to tell you the truth. When you're handwriting something, it sticks with you better and it's more helpful. So you could do that while we're going through my little list here. The next set of questions that you can use focus on looking at the accuracy of the identified thoughts, not necessarily looking at keywords. So the first question is, am I distressing myself unnecessarily? Now you want to ask this question without judgment on yourself. It doesn't mean, you don't want the answer to be, yes, I'm so stupid, I'm getting frustrated over nothing. Because especially if you have something like PTSD or something else like that, that kind of, oh man, I'm so dumb, I can't. Why is it that I am distressed unnecessarily when I used to be able to handle XYZ thing? I know how that feels, and it's very frustrating. It was really, really humiliating to have difficulty like going outside when I've held dead people. I've dealt with much bigger things. So why am I unnecessarily distressed about something that seems small, right? That's not the point of this exercise. The point of the exercise isn't to look at the thought and then judge yourself about it and be angry. And this is why you do the top section first, I think anyway, because then you can see, oh, I'm shooting myself about my unnecessary distress, right? Or I'm calling myself stupid about my unnecessary distress, all those kind of things, right? So you can see where your, how you approach the questions matters. But how can I see this in another or less distressing way is a really great way to frame the question. What are some other ways of viewing the situation? This is actually very helpful for decatastrophizing, because when you, and it's difficult, and I do have decatastrophizing exercises we can go through some other time, but if there is any way to see the situation as not an emergency, sometimes you can actually think better about the situation itself. Now, a lot of times in a high-stress situation, you have to focus on making a plan. You can't be sitting and, going through all these questions and doing all these exercises when you need to operate on someone or something like that, right? You have to be able to be in the moment, and that's where kind of your mindfulness practice from DBT or just some of your high-stress training can really kick in. But in general, when you're finding yourself dealing with distressing thoughts, especially like for insomnia at night on your bed, as it's circling and circling, you can pause and you can ask yourself, am I distressing myself unnecessarily? Is there another way to look at this situation? And that's a hard question, so this isn't my favorite question. I don't like this question very much, but nevertheless, whether I like it or not, it is one of the questions that they recommend you look at. Is my thinking working for or against me? How could I view this in a way that could be more helpful? This is, I think, a very helpful question Because sometimes instead of judging yourself and being like, oh, my thinking is bad, see, like, is this helping me, right? Like this train of thought that I'm having, is it helping me get to sleep right now? For example, there is a common train of thought people will have when they can't sleep, where the thought will be, oh no, it's already 3 a.m., I'm going to be so tired tomorrow, I'm going to be so miserable tomorrow, I'm going to be so upset, it's all going to be so terrible, yada, 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 right? That is a good time to pause and ask yourself, is that train of thought helpful? Because that particular train of thought will actually distress you more. Worrying about how little sleep you're getting actually makes it harder to get to sleep. So while it may be a logical and valid train of thought to be like, oh no, it's 3 a.m, I'm going to have a miserable day tomorrow, that train of thought actually isn't helpful. And once we realize that, then we're able to start stopping it. So, what am I demanding must happen? What do I want or prefer rather than need? Does this question make sense? The phrasing of this question might be a little bit confusing, but basically it's asking, the thing that I feel like I need this to happen, do I really need it? Or is it something that I want or prefer? And if it's something I want, that can actually help you calm down a little bit, because it can help you realize, okay, I'm going to be okay if I don't have this. Another way to deal with this question and the two questions before it is to kind of ask, what will happen if things do go bad here? What is the most likely thing to happen? What is the worst thing that could happen? What is the best thing that could happen? That's where we get into decatastrophizing. Because if you know what the worst thing is, you can say, okay, well, if that happens, what will I do? How do I plan for it? Don't spend too long on that. You go back to what is the best thing that could happen, right? What is the most likely outcome? Those are difficult because they require some honesty and insight that a lot of times we don't have when we're particularly anxious. I still think they're helpful. They're helpful if you can pause and actually work through them. So, what do you want or prefer rather than need? Am I making something too terrible? Is it really that awful? And I don't like that question because it's especially judgmental. What would be so terrible about that? Even if it were as terrible as I imagine, is there still something I could do? And like I said, some of these questions are a little tiny bit, like for somebody like me, it can turn around and be very self-judgy. But again, a different way to ask kind of that same question would be, will I still be able to accomplish my mission or my goal if XYZ thing happens? So for example, I am stressing lately because the military made an error a couple years ago, and in order to cover their butts, they're sending out some paperwork rather late about me that can affect some of the way I function. And it's frustrating because they were supposed to do that a year and a half ago, and that situation is no longer the same as it was. It's the kind of thing, I don't want to go into too much, but it's the kind of thing that can really, really stress you out because it can affect as a physician, it can affect your ability to, perform and live. Basically, they were supposed to make sure that I was okay and safe a couple years ago, and they didn't. They kind of forgot. My psychologist gave some information about the risk that my job was posing to me at the time because I was having some significant mental health issues, which now I've gotten a lot better. And it's frustrating because now they're acting the way they should have acted a year and a half ago, and now I'm a lot better. So some of the restrictions that they want to send forth on me are no longer applicable and could actually make things worse for me. So anyway, there's a whole lot of paperwork that happens if you're a physician and you've been sick or you've had a mental illness. There are some states that will actually discriminate against you for having a mental health disorder. Like Florida, you can't even get licensed if in the last 5 years you've had a mental health disorder. They're incredibly disgusting and discriminatory, which is why I'm not going to get licensed in Florida, because that's gross. It's technically a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act, but physicians are good little boys and girls and don't really challenge these kind of things, so that goes nowhere. But basically there's a lot of paperwork about these things, and when I first got the letter about this last month, just seeing the letterhead with military on it put me in a panic because it reminded me of some things that had happened when I was trying to protect one of my sexual assault patients, or unwanted sexual contact patients. So like just that put me in a panic, right? And now I'm still kind of dealing with some of the like emotional aftershock of there's a lot of stress surrounding this paperwork. But one of the questions that my therapist asked me, my trauma therapist who's doing CPT, which is a trauma therapy, which is similar to CBT but not the same, one of the things he asked me was, will you still be able to do what you need to do in Paraguay if this paperwork goes through in a way that's unfavorable? And the answer is yes. I'll actually still be able to accomplish all my main missions. So that puts the calm, makes it a lot calmer. It's just more of a blow to my self-esteem and more frustrating because it feels like they're bothering me still. But the reality is I can still accomplish my mission. So I think that version of those questions is helpful when you're catastrophizing a lot, to sit back, at least for me. These questions are helpful for a lot of people. I am someone who some of these questions I get too sensitive about. And for me, an alternative question to ask that kind of rephrases these questions is, okay, even if it is bad like this, can I still accomplish my goal? Or, alternatively, how can I still do what I need to do if XYZ negative thing happens? Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense. Am I labeling a person in an extreme fashion? What's the action or behavior that I don't like? This is another one that is maybe not as applicable in a trauma setting, which is why I don't love CBT for trauma, especially like sexual health trauma, because, you know, if you're labeling the person who is a rapist as having done a horrible, horrible thing, that's not really an extreme fashion. And so a lot of folks who've had a previous trauma, like a sexual abuse trauma or something like that, where these really violent or horrific things have happened, a lot of times if you try to challenge them as having extreme reactions, it's not going to be helpful, right? It's going to make things worse. But for depression, just MDD depression, this is a really, really helpful and good series of questions. And this one in particular, especially if you're having interpersonal issues, am I labeling this person in extreme fashion, right? What is the action or behavior that I don't like? And I really like that second part of the question, what is the action or behavior I don't like? Because then you can actually break it down and address it with them, rather than this person is a horrible person. You can think more constructive thoughts like, can I ask them not to do this action? Or can I avoid this action when it comes up, right? You can be specific. And that makes for much better communication. It's much healthier, much friendlier and healthier and more good. if that makes sense. So I hope those were helpful. I hope you get a chance to write some of them down. A lot of CBT is very thinky like this, where it can sometimes seem like you're arguing with yourself. It really has its uses. It has its places where it doesn't work so much, but certainly it's something that you can practice for yourself for self-care. And it's been proven to be equal to most of our SSRI medications when it comes to MDD. So rearranging some of these thoughts for a lot of cases is going to make a pretty big difference.